afternoon. It's Sean Henderson from our science department who carried the theme of asylum seekers forward into the question about the role that democracies can play, and within democracies, the political processes of domestic politics and the influence that they can have. Sean?
Okay, again, thank you for having me. Fortunately, I have been the last speaker before, so I knew to prepare an abbreviated version just in case I needed to. So, won't keep you late. The question at the heart of this conference is really, right from your flyer, how do human rights apply to vulnerable, exploitable, expendable populations in today's world? And asylum seekers, who we were just hearing a little bit about, are people who've shown up in a second country and presented themselves to authorities claiming to have fled their home country on the basis that they had no choice but to escape their home country to avoid persecution or to avoid torture or to avoid death, either at the hands of their country or at the hands of people that their country just can't protect them from. And this right to seek asylum and many of the protections to be afforded to claimants and to granted asylum, people who were granted asylum, are codified in this 1951 Refugee Convention. But there's something strange that this convention does. It leaves all the rules regarding the adjudication of actual asylum cases, and it leaves a lot of the questions regarding the treatment of people whose cases remain pending completely at the discretion to whatever state, whatever country these people wind up in. So asylum seekers, just as people, are vulnerable in two ways. First of all, they've had to leave home. They're outside their country, away from everything they've ever known, away from families, away from their languages. But they're also at the mercy of whatever rules might be in place for receiving and hosting asylum seekers in whichever country they might have landed. So, first, where do these people run and why? And you need to remember that most asylum seekers are running for their lives. Because of this, they wind up in the first country they can get to. Most countries where people run to are not adjacent to, again, fully fledged, fully consolidated, wealthy democracies. But even if we put this geographic contiguity aside, there is a very real and very important ongoing crisis involving people escaping for their lives to wealthy, advanced, consolidated democracies. And the focus of my work, personally, as a scholar of comparative politics, is this. How do the differences in rules for doing asylum, the rules that each country has to come up with itself, how are those rules responsible for the different types of tragedies that we see across the world today? And these differences, because they are the result of internal politics or internal decision-making, these differences are inherently political. But the literature on these tragedies doesn't really look at the political nature of what's happening in countries. You see a lot of the work being done by scholars of, basically by area studies experts, or by scholars of international relations. You don't see a lot of cross-national work looking at asylum, looking specifically at where does this rule lead to this outcome. You don't see a lot of that. Instead, what you really see a lot of when you look at what scholars have to say, even to date, you see them trying to explain the number of asylum claimants or trying to explain different levels of generosity among asylum-receiving countries to various input factors. And so you will see a lot of explanations that have to do with the wealth of the receiving country, or the level of economic growth, or the ability to cross a country's border, or just domestic measures of xenophobia. But none of these measures either in isolation or in interaction in any combination with other variables, really provides an answer that maps very well onto the world of asylum seekers that we see today. And I suggest that answers that the field is generally trying to come up with are bound to fail because these explanations are theoretically answers to two very discrete questions that seem to be conflated in the minds of a lot of researchers. And so specifically what I've done is I've disaggregated this question into two discrete questions. Instead, what I do is I look at the question of where. Where can we expect that whatever rules are put in place in a specific country are going to actually have any effect on the outcomes that we see within that country? That's the where question. But some of these other variables that scholars have been looking at, again, for about 20 years now, have to do more with how a country's asylum rules are going to bring about whatever consequences we see in the world today. And so here's how I did that. I disaggregated this overall question into the two discrete questions. And so how did that do? Wait. Okay. I was told the top button would be a pointer because I knew that pointer. Sorry.
You have it upside down?
Maybe. Possibly. Yes, I did. Thank you. No.
It's
Oh.
the one that looks like a bullseye.
The one that looks like a bullseye. Oh.
Pull it down.
I am holding
That's
the
to the right,
bullseye
to the
down.
right, to the right.
Okay, I see now. Thank you so much. And so basically what I've done is I have along this, oh, I'm looking at it upside down too, okay. Okay. You know, I'll just point. Along this horizontal axis, what I'm really looking for is measures of how we can expect for a country's rules to actually matter. And in order to measure this, I look at a lot of input factors. What I'm looking at is, for example, state wealth. On the basis of wealthy countries are more likely to be pressured by the international community, by their own public, to pay out on any generosity they may promise or on any rule they may put in place. Whereas more leeway will be granted to poorer countries under the same conditions. I look at basically the ability on the part of the potential asylum claimant to cross the border into the country as more claimants have basically a more open border suggests a more tried system and also a system that will have addressed rules, its rule-making procedures much more potentially adequately. I look at the predilection on the part of any receiving country to have approved prior claims for asylum. And I also look at the anticipated per person cost to the state to host each claimant, both during the adjudication process, but also after the period that all appeals have been exhausted. So I'm looking at the cost of appeals where they're permitted. I'm looking at the cost of multiple appeals. I'm also looking at the cost of the deportation procedures where these are in place. And so higher measures on this, for the reasons I just stated, lead to a higher likelihood or an increased likelihood that what we're actually going to see is rules in place that will have an effect on actual treatment of asylum seekers within the country. But then along the vertical axis here, what I'm looking at are political questions, really. If rules are going to matter to outcomes, what kinds of rules should we expect elites, rulemakers to come up with? And so here I measure direction of elite mass influence on issues relating to immigration in general. I look at the country's history of using its public sector employees in order to further political ends. I look at the practical saleability on the part of the electorate to avoid the potential cost of doing asylum. I also look at over 300 electoral party platforms for 44 countries and the electoral results in each of these countries over a period of 10 years. And so what you see here in Q1, and the quadrants are labeled here, what we see is the most intuitive scenario and also the most likely scenario. And what you see is that here, whatever rule is in place should first of all, be of use to help us to understand what's happening with asylum seekers here. But that rule in place should predict that the states involved are trying to cut costs. So effectively, in the states in Q1, elected rulemakers will get reelected if they promise to cut costs. And under this condition, we see what's really the most obvious tragedy. You see a large number of people left in limbo, again, caught within bureaucratic webs, often waiting decades to find out if they will be judged worthy of asylum in whatever country they've landed in. And so their situation of precariousness is sustained. They build lives in their host country, but the whole time they're doing this, they have no reasonable expectation that they're ever really going to find themselves free from torture or death in the country they ran from. Because anytime a decision comes down, they can be sent back. And we see this pattern of action, again, most clearly, and I could talk you through any of these examples if you'd like to hear about them. In post-1980, mid-1980s Austria, you see this post-mid-1990s South Africa, post-2000s France and Greece, and also just very recently in the United States as well, all located up there, right there in Q1. But right below that, Q4, we have another scenario. And this one is a little bit more theoretically interesting. And I've done more writing on this scenario because it's just a little bit stranger. It's a little bit less intuitive. Here, the rules in place are also predicted to matter because you're going that way on the horizontal. But in these countries, what I see is that elites are judging it more politically expedient either to accept or to embrace the full potential cost of complying with the 51 Refugee Convention. And it's not because they're more generous or more altruistic in general. What it actually looks like when this happens, and again, I can talk you through how this happens in a few countries if you're interested, is that by promising to take a small loss on issues of Refugee Convention compliance, basically they get votes because they're nesting that small loss within the larger gain, to make gains on a larger issue. You see this happening. You see this happening in Belgium, South Korea, and this actually breeds a different type of tragedy. And the tragedy that we see here is the potential for protest. Because what happens following the government making this sort of decision that says, we will spend more more than the global norm. You see people starting to ask questions. Why is the money and effort that could be used to better the lives of our people instead being used to help these people at a level that exceeds the global norm? And again, we see this most clearly with the rise of the far right, post-2000s in Norway and Sweden, post-2008 in Belgium, the rise, some of the rise of the right in just Eastern Europe in general, most specifically the Czech Republic here. And we also see the very strong potential for this to emerge if something happens to increase refugee flows to South Korea, because all of the necessary components are there in South Korea. I can talk you through that as well, again, if time permits. But what about Q2 and Q3 on the left side of the screen here? And here an entirely different question is at play. What if the rules themselves really aren't going to matter that much? Under that condition, what kind of rules can we really expect to find in place? And in nearly every one of these countries, you can find laws and procedures on the books that don't necessarily square with the preconditions or with the conditions that you would predict if you were just looking at basically the right-left issue. Instead, if the rules aren't going to matter, what you see is elites perceiving the freedom to use their own laws and procedures as a form of cheap talk. Basically, they can promise whatever will make them popular because they know that there is barely any likelihood that they will ever be called on to pay out on the full cost of whatever they promised. So essentially, they can promise anything. And there's no tragedy at all. Wait for it. Unless something eventually happens, unless something shifts in the world, and all of a sudden that country is called on to finally pay out on this stuff that it promised, just as a form of cheap talk. And this is exactly how I interpret what happened in the UK leading up to the Brexit vote. We can see it starting to happen in countries as diverse as Mexico and Poland. And the only way to prevent this kind of tragedy, if a country does suddenly face calls to pay out, is basically to incorporate cost avoiding tactics. So basically what you would be doing is you would be basically replacing this complete paralysis because our rules are no longer sufficient. We can't pay out on the cost of our rules. Just turning those countries into Q1 countries, where again, people are just stuck waiting in limbo for generations, or not generations, for years, sometimes even decades. So, really, in short, it's all political. And what kind of things do Democratic elites need to do to stay in office? And that's what's up on the board. And very little that's been done at the international level has proven useful in changing specifically the domestic politics of any receiving country. And so you see this all the time. You see efforts to go into Austria and tell them that fleeing is never voluntary. You see efforts to go into Chile to say, well, you know what, you owe this to the rest of the world because of the way that the rest of the world took in people who fled under Pinochet. You see this all over the world with the United Nations trying to basically change people's minds. But it doesn't change who people vote for. It doesn't necessarily change who people vote for when they go to the ballot in their own country. And so my point is, in saying that, is that elections and the procedures that result from the work of elected officials remain unique to each individual country. And so the big point behind telling you this is that our best hope of changing anything is really to change stuff in the country where we can vote. And so, remember back at the input factors that suggest that our rules in the United States should matter. We're wealthy, our border has historically been open to asylum seekers, and it costs very little compared to our per capita GDP to host and process asylum seekers, and even to eventually deport denied asylum claimants. So our rules are going to matter for all of these reasons. And so what we need is for, specifically in the United States, for the anti-immigration camp to understand that asylum, the right to asylum, isn't just what you call illegal migration. It often is, technically, because, I think about it, if you need to run for your life or the life of your family, you are going to be willing to purchase false entry documents in order to get there. You are willing to pay a smuggler to save your life. You are willing to do whatever it takes to save your life and the life of your family. So, if our concern is to uphold the values inherent to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for these most vulnerable, exploitable, and expendable populations, really, we need to consider seriously how we treat these asylum seekers, these people who've run for their lives and come here to the United States. That was my short version. So, honestly, I'm happy to take any questions, and if you would like any input, again, on any of the countries I mentioned specifically, I'm happy to talk you through those. Yes, please.
I was recently in Poland, and I saw that it seemed like a country that would be a perfect place for asylum seekers. They have a lot of new business. It seems like things are changing. There's a lot of people, international folks, international business. So I was just, but the population for the most part that we spoke to were really defiant. They talked about wanting to preserve their Polska, their heritage, and they felt like that had been taken over so many times. What about like Eastern European countries? I think that was something that I was really curious about.
Yeah, I was going to say that Poland has a lot in common with Hungary in that respect. In that, specifically, first of all, you notice that Hungary isn't on this because it didn't meet actually all of the criteria for inclusion as a fully democratic country. It was certain technicalities that left Hungary on this list. But Poland, again, very similar in that what you see is a situation in which the rules were written at a time when nobody was moving to Poland, at a time when nobody was thinking of Poland as the place to go. A lot of this was exacerbated. In fact, in the video that you showed, you were interviewing somebody with MSF, and I believe the last thing that she said was that Europe could change this, but then more people would come into it. Am I mangling that quote?
It was, yeah, but it would be in a longer context, but she talks about deterrence.
Okay.
And so having these terrible, terrible places deters people from coming.
Okay. The way I interpreted that, okay, because that changes what I was going to say.
Well, you could say what you're...
Okay. Because honestly, the way that I interpreted that was just in terms of the Dublin Convention. In terms of the fact that once you land in Greece, you cannot go to any other European country to claim asylum.
Yeah.
And so that's the problem, because Greece is so geographically close to the places people are running from. When you see Italy and you see France sending people back to their home countries. In fact, right before the Arab Spring, Italy had, it's a little bit of a complicated situation. But basically what happened was Libya was agreeing to take everybody Italy just didn't want to reach their border, because you can't claim asylum until you have reached the border of a new country. And so the problem...
But the problem is
Yes.
with imaginary lines, you know, in the ocean. So you're getting
Yes.
violations every day of Turkish Coast Guard, Libyan Coast Guard crossing that line. And it's creating a lot of issues.
Yeah, especially with the islands just a mile away from Turkey being
Yeah.
still Greece. Yeah, so I know what you're saying. But the way I'm actually trying to answer your question is that because there aren't a lot of people just landing in Hungary or landing in Poland as a place of first asylum, and there never have been. And so the rules that were put in place both in Poland and in Hungary were put in place at a time when there really weren't any calls they didn't perceive any calls they'd have to pay out on anything they might promise. And so it was also, the rules in Poland were actually much more generous than in Hungary, but the rules in Poland were basically rules that they couldn't live up to once the refugee crisis started happening. And so people started looking for reasons. People started looking for reasons, and they're always really defined as soon as you want to find a reason. And so, yeah, basically that's what you see. That's what you see in a lot of Eastern Europe. Actually, you also see that. Where do you see that? Actually, the only other country I can really attribute that to is Lithuania. But again, very similar motivation. Rules were put in place, sort of generous, but generous at a time when they could afford to be generous because they didn't think they would ever have to pay out on the cost of their generosity. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, I was thinking more so like in relocation. I know that the current administration in Poland is very similar to Trump, and they have a lot of similarities. However, I just think that it would be an ideal place, but I don't know, for asylum seekers seeking relocation after they've already been granted their asylum being placed in somewhere like Poland, but I guess that's not really fair. Which would increase like these people that are kind of like, I mean, where I'm getting at is there you have these people that are stuck in these camps for years, and the excuse is always we don't have anywhere to put them or any place for them to go. That's the process is just long, and you know if we could start moving people in greater numbers to places like Poland,
Yeah.
and placing them there.
And actually, Poland is one of the few large countries in Europe that actually hasn't suspended Dublin transfers from Greece. And so you potentially could wind up in Poland and be sent back to Greece, whereas you cannot wind up in France and be sent back to Greece.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, please.
I think this is a very enlightening presentation. I'd just like to somehow push to a point where we may wish to question sometimes the value of, I'm a pro-democratic kind of guy, and I work for the United Nations, so
Okay.
I should be in favor. But we can now somehow, in some instances, question the value of democracy and the truthfulness of generosity. The problem that we are facing here is that all those people who are moving around the world and whose personal histories have been captured so well by Anne's documentary are the same people to whom for years and years and years, since the convention you mentioned, these people have been told, you know what? The Western world is the world of democracy, also the world of generosity. So they abide by norms, they apply the rule of law, they respect borders, they do things. But these people were not reminded that democracy also opened the door to Hitler. He came to power through democracy. He was voted in. And these people should also be told that in this country, it was different. You were differently treated whether you are from Haiti or from Cuba.
Oh yeah.
So
Specifically here, yeah.
So let's think about the borders or about the sea not having blurred lines and that everything were clear. The fact still remains that people who vote may not necessarily vote to change countries in the good sense of the word. They can actually vote to make the country far worse. And people who decide to cross the Sahara or decide to cross the seas know very well that they should do that because they have been told a lie for a long time. So they'll try what they can because somebody has told them in the ear, it's time for you to leave, because they know that something bad is coming. So I think that one of the complicating factors is actually the lies and the lack of consistent abidance by the rules that we have in the countries that have money, power, and veto power.
Yes, and so as a two-part answer to your question, first of all, that's one of the big reasons that I undertook this study, to try to get answers just as much about asylum as to how democracy works, as to how the rule-making process is responsible for what we see. But second of all, you are definitely correct in that democracy itself is no cure for this problem. In certain cases, it has been. In certain cases, in certain very limited cases, the democracy itself has gotten it right. For example, in Belgium, what we saw is the advance of one Flemish and one Walloon, basically far-right extremist party. But then immediately afterward, every other country, every other party in government basically came together and issued a declaration that we will not enter into a coalition with any far-right party. And so, basically, because they had the specific parliamentary system, they were allowed to eradicate all far-right dialogue from the news, from the popular consciousness even, because the people who are talking about that are guaranteed not to win because of how our rules for doing government work here in Belgium. But what you see more often is exactly what you suggest. What you see more often is rules being made, even where the rules look like they're generous. Either the rules are really cheap talk, or because that generosity is nested within a larger selfishness. Because that generosity is nested within, maybe we can take a small loss on this in order to get a bigger win on something else. And what people fail to realize is that those small losses are other people's lives.
Have you attempted to look at, say, not democracy as such, but religion, for example? What role does religion play in Poland, in Hungary, and in those places where it's about refugees?
Okay, what I'm going to do right now, that's a question I hadn't thought about. So what I'm going to look...
I can say something really
Oh,
quick.
yes, please.
Can I just, we were just in Poland doing the same talk. We were greeted by a man who was a Muslim asylum seeker from Afghanistan. They had tried to start a mosque in Krakow, which is like the second biggest city in Poland. Very international city. They started meeting in an apartment and they called it just an Islamic center. Within 2 days it was shut down by the community. They had death threats. They were told if they didn't shut it down. I don't know, this is just from my personal perspective, so you can, elaborate more, but that was just one story, so I can only imagine how much, in other neighboring countries, how the resistance to different religions is definitely hard.
Oh, no, I appreciate that. Because the only answer that I had to that was, let's take a look at this chart and let's see where the Orthodox countries, where the Catholic countries, where are the, and just, again, something I wasn't necessarily prepared for. What you see, I see no pattern here whatsoever. I see no discernible pattern. I see basically no discernible patterns here based on religion in any of the 4 quadrants.
Religion,
Oh, I'm sorry, I slipped away from my phone. Just because I wasn't anticipating that question. For example, if you look at this chart, there are no discernible clusters by religion. And so what I would say is that religion doesn't necessarily map onto the questions that I've asked, because if it did, we'd see that map on the screen. It is a different type of question, and I would almost say that it's not the type of question that a scholar of comparative politics is going to necessarily be looking for the answer to, because again, we're trying to look at how politics works and not necessarily how religion works. But again, that's a very good question, and my only answer to that is that religion doesn't seem to map onto these, say, clusters of religion don't seem to map onto this very neatly at all.
what about race?
What about race? Let's see.
Race, particularly again, going back to Poland
Okay.
or Bulgaria.
Okay, are you talking about the race of the people coming into the country, or the race? Okay.
The race of the people. Poland, for example, had a lot of foreign students at one time. But these were temporary migrants. They were not there to stay. But the ones coming in now have a different status. Are they welcome or not?
I honestly wouldn't say they have a different status, that they have no status, because asylum has not been conferred on these people yet. They're actually left in Poland still waiting for the system for adjudicating the process to catch up with the demand. This is why Poland is saying we cannot handle this right now. And so
race
again,
does matter.
I'm sorry?
Race does matter.
But again, I would caution invoking race onto the specific questions that I'm looking at, and let me explain why. With the exception of, I want to say, Israel and South Africa, and probably Mexico, Chile, the race of the people coming in is pretty much the same. You tend to see a lot of people coming from the same areas of the world. You tend to see, again, not to lump Africa into a single homogeneous unit, but you tend to see people coming from the Middle East and Central Africa a lot. In nearly every one of these countries, again, with the exceptions that I pointed out just now. You see a lot of Jewish migration to Israel. Israel, by the way, is the country that's most likely to approve an asylum claim. But at the same time, only if you're Jewish are you going to even try. But aside from that, if you look at who is going into Belgium and Norway and Sweden and Czech Republic and Romania and Finland and the United States and Greece and El Salvador and Austria and Canada,
And the United States.
and the United States is
According to Donald Trump.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry, what do you say about Donald Trump?
Donald Trump says he would prefer people from Europe.
People are claiming asylum from Europe.
Yeah, that's what he says.
Well, people are not claiming asylum from Europe.
Donald Trump says. He says,
Okay, I'm not, what I'm doing is I'm looking specifically at asylum. I'm not looking at immigration in general. And so if you were looking at immigration, then yes, your question applies. I'm looking specifically at the rules of doing asylum. And people are not seeking asylum from France or from Germany or from even Greece or Poland. People are not seeking asylum from those countries. And if they were seeking asylum from those countries, they would have very little basis of being found to be members of protected classes necessarily. Not just that, but asylum decisions tend in general to not come down on in favor of the applicant if the applicant was from a friendly country in general, or from a trade partner country in general, which is why you're much more likely, as you were mentioning, to be granted asylum in the United States if you come from Cuba than you are if you're granted asylum in the United States if you come from Mexico. Claim will get denied if you're from Mexico, claim will get approved if you're from Cuba. Was this clear?
okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and I am 2 minutes over. And so, yeah, I will hand it back to you. Thank you.